Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we will be discussing the first step to finding the money you need for college and completing the FAFSA. This webinar is being recorded. All participants have been muted, so please use the Q&A box for any questions. All attendees will receive a follow-up email with today's recording and presentation deck within a week. Your presenter today is Jeff Lackey. He is the Director of Relationship Management at Sallie Mae. And with that, I'd like to now hand it off to Jeff. Welcome, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Lena, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this presentation. Hopefully you'll find it very informative. There may be a mix of attendees today that may have been involved with filing a FAFSA in previous years, maybe for another family member and such. And then, of course, this may be obviously your first time filing the FAFSA, or maybe just learning what the FAFSA is, for instance. So we're going to be kind of covering a few of the topics today, but I really appreciate being able to join Provident Credit Union today and talk about this topic. As mentioned, we are going to discuss a little bit about the timelines and deadlines within the FAFSA, basically how you get started, and then also kind of give you some of the lingo. As you start to enter the realm of college and university, higher education, and not only in admissions, but also in financial aid, and even when it comes to transactional accounts, paying your bill and such, you're going to find that you are going to be dealing with a lot of abbreviations, a lot of acronyms, and obviously there's going to be some names and some things that you'll have to get familiar with as you're going through the process. So we're going to try and highlight some of those. Today's presentation is primarily going to be about the FAFSA, its role within the financial aid process. We don't necessarily cover what the financial aid process is today, but we're going to just basically demonstrate the importance of the FAFSA. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So the FAFSA, basically the FAFSA, what it is it is known as the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, which obviously the acronym, and I just mentioned that on the previous slide. Here's the very first acronym, the FAFSA. It is the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, and it's basically the first step in applying for any federal and some state as well as institutional aid, institutional being a college or university. It's perhaps the most important form that you're going to fill out to determine your financial aid eligibility. And the Department of Education has stated that they are committed to opening the academic year 25-26 FAFSA. So again, that is going to be the academic year 25-26 FAFSA. It will be open and available to apply by December 1st of 2024. So just in a couple of months. And so with that, the idea and the premise behind it is that you will file the FAFSA as soon as on or after December 1st, or if the Department of Education releases it a bit earlier, whatever that date is. But the idea and the premise is to file the FAFSA and get that information completed and get it sent out to the colleges and universities that you are interested in applying for admission and attending, so that they can start doing the financial aid offer building as soon as possible. The one thing about the FAFSA is that you may, if you were to just go out and do an internet search, you would see that the FAFSA typically opens. There's going to be some verbiage out there that the FAFSA typically opens on October 1st of each and every year. And typically in many years, it is open on October 1st. But last year, for the academic year 24-25, the Department of Education did a major overhaul on the FAFSA application form, and they changed some of the methodologies, changed some of the formulas and such to make it more user-friendly and to hopefully allow for more families, students and families, to qualify for more aid. And in so doing, just like anything, when there's an update, there's some growing pains and such. And so in order to make sure that the FAFSA is ready for everybody to use for the academic year 25-26, they've had to take a short couple of month delay. So that's the reason why we're looking at December 1st, or by December 1st, as being the opening day. for FAFSA this year. But if this all works out well and everything's great, then by next year we should see a return to October 1st of every year moving forward that the FAFSA will be open. It's really important that you complete the FAFSA, like I said, as early as possible. And the reason for that is that some financial aid programs are awarded on a first come, first served basis. And this also goes for returning college students. So if you're in attendance today on the presentation and you're already in college and you're trying to learn more about what the FAFSA processing year is going to be, this will apply to you just as much as it will apply to new students. Maybe you're a senior in high school, or maybe you're a returning working parent, and you're looking at returning back to school. This information every year, each and every year, you will file a FAFSA for the years that you are in college. It's not just for new students. So bank on having to file this each and every year. The one thing to remember, if you happen to apply late, you could miss out on some funding options. And that's all dependent upon what those funding options are. There are federal aid options that the FAFSA makes you, that allows for financial aid offices to review your eligibility for. Some state aid programs, in particular, the Cal Grant, for instance, uses information derived from the FAFSA that the financial aid office uses and determines your eligibility for the Cal Grant program, which is a very lucrative state aid program. That if you're a California resident attending UC, CSU, the community colleges, systems, and certain private schools, that you could be eligible for the Cal Grant program. Again, they're going to use some information from the FAFSA to determine your eligibility for that. And then, of course, lastly, institutional aid. Some institutional aid is going to be merit-based, which means it's going to be aid that is given to you based on maybe academics or athletics or a special talent, for instance, or maybe being part of an organization or becoming part of a student group on campus, for instance. That would all be merit-based aid. But some of the institutional aid that is awarded by financial aid offices at particular colleges and universities is what they call need-based aid. And the need-based aid means that there's going to be a financial factor that is needed in the determination of aid eligibility. And again, they will most likely use what is called the FAFSA to help you determine your eligibility, with the exception of the Pell Grant, which is the main federal grant supplied by the Department of Education, Federal Student Aid Division, and granted from Congress, funded by Congress. The idea is that this is what you would consider an entitlement program, meaning that whenever you file the FAFSA, as long as you meet the eligibility criteria, you are able to receive a portion of the FAFSA. Not all aid options work that way. Many of the aid options, other than the Pell Grant, is going to be what is called a finite source of money, which means that once that money runs out, you're not eligible for it, whether you qualify for it per the FAFSA determination or not. So that's part of the reason why you want to file the FAFSA as early as possible. For those students that are applying to college, keep in mind that financial aid deadlines are not the same as the college admission deadlines. So make sure that you work with the college and universities that you're looking at to determine both the admission deadline and the financial aid deadline. And lastly, don't assume that you are not eligible for aid because you think your family's income is too high, because almost every student is eligible for some form of financial aid. And aid eligibility is based on several factors. It's not just income and savings. So there are two things that the student and the parent need to do before you can start filing the FAFSA. The first that you need to do is apply for an FSA ID, which stands for a Federal Student Aid Identification. You don't need to apply for an FSA ID if you already have one established from a previous year. So if you're a returning student or a parent of a returning student, and you've already filed an FSA ID, you don't need to do this year after year. But if you are a new student and you are the parent of a dependent new student, you do need to establish an FSA ID. And you establish this once, and you can use it again for the same one throughout the process. And if you don't have an FSA ID, we recommend that you apply for one roughly 3 to 5 days before you start filing the FAFSA or intend to file the FAFSA. So as we mentioned, the FAFSA is not going to open anytime soon. It should open sometime by December 1st. So there's plenty of time to go out and do your FSA ID. And you can see the web link on the left side of the slides. You can find your FSA ID link at studentaid.gov and then click on FSA ID in order to start the process. So basically, we recommend that you start that roughly 3 to 5 days before you intend to fill out the FAFSA, because your information needs to be verified from the Social Security Administration. So it may take them a couple of days for it to become active. The next element is the need for multi-factor authentication, which is also referred to as two-step verification. Along with an FSA ID and password, users are going to get a secure code via text. It may also come in the form of an email, or it may also come in the form of an authentication app. And you, as the applicant, get to choose whether you want it to come via text, email, or authentication app. And that's in order to log into studentaid.gov to start your FAFSA. The user, you're going to determine the preference on how you receive it. And again, once that MFA, that multi-factor authentication method, is set up by you, the user, you will be presented with a backup code. So you will be filing your FSA ID. You will then have to do a multi-factor authentication or get a two-factor authentication code via text, email, or the authentication app. And then third, you will be getting what is called a backup code. That backup code is exactly what it sounds like. It's a backup code that allows a user to log in without your MFA, your multi-factor authentication, if you do not have access to your code via text, email, or authentication app. So when you get this backup code, please know that this is the only time you, the user, will be presented with this backup code. So make sure that when you receive it, print it out, secure it, write it down, put it in a secure place. That backup code will be only given to you once. So here's some information that we've also listed with, along with the applicable documents that are going to be needed in order to complete the FAFSA. Some things are relatively commonplace, but you may notice federal income tax return and W-2s are not listed as needed information. So for anybody that may have filed a FAFSA in the past years, that was obviously information that was great to have for your use. For those of you that are new to the FAFSA, you may be saying, well, how are they going to determine my income information and such if I'm not giving them tax return or W-2 information, or I don't need it in front of me at the time? And that's the reason that Department of Ed and the IRS have set up what is called a direct data transfer of financial information. And it's called the Future Act Direct Data Exchange. And here's another acronym for you, the FADDX. And you can see it down in that purplish color box at the middle bottom of the page. That FADDX, or the Future Act Direct Data Exchange, that eliminates the need for tax information for the vast majority of FAFSA filers. That means that no more tax forms or W-2s, which has greatly reduced the number of questions that's going to be on the FAFSA. One thing to remember about the FADDX process is that the user, as well as a parent, if it's a student that is dependent, you are not going to be able to see each other's financial information. So parents, if you're worried that by including your information from the FADDX is going to take your income information and put it on the FAFSA, of which then student and or financial aid offices would be able to see it, it's going to be hidden. Users must agree to use the FADDX process via an authorization of access and transfer of data. So you're going to have to agree to use the FADDX when you're in the FAFSA. And this is going to be for each and every user. So for the dependent student and the parent, or just the independent student if the student is considered dependent by FAFSA purposes. If students do not authorize access to and the transfer of tax information, you may be able to key in your tax information, but you're not going to be able to get an index number from that. And we'll tell you what the index number is in an upcoming slide. But essentially, it's going to heavily restrict what financial aid offices would be able to utilize from the FAFSA information. The transferred tax information is used to calculate what is called the Student Aid Index Number, that SAI. And there's a third acronym for you, Student Aid Index, or SAI. So you're going to hear financial aid offices, you're even going to see it in communications back and forth from Department of Education when they send your FAFSA information back to you. They're going to refer to the Student Aid Index, or SAI number. And unlike students and parents, financial information is sent to the school in case they have to verify conflicting information or calculate professional judgment. You may want to keep this in mind if you know your financial situation has changed since the tax filing year. So having said that, the information is not going to be readily available for users of the FAFSA in order to see it, but in circumstances, and we'll talk about special circumstances or professional judgment in an upcoming slide, but there may be need for financial aid office to see some of that information if, let's say, you've had a change in employment, or you've had, unfortunately, in other parts of the country, we're seeing some very disastrous natural disasters that are happening. If there are, situations that are basically not reflective of the income that you have readily on hand to pay for college because it's unfortunately had to be used in more like extreme emergency or things that are not covered by insurance, for instance, or other types of special circumstances, case in point, a loss of employment. Financial aid offices do have a particular way that they can try and make your financial situation a little bit more reflective of what your current situation is. And like I said, we'll talk about that on an upcoming slide. Lastly, I want to reflect also too that when you file the FAFSA, you can ask for up to 20 schools, colleges and universities to be included in on the FAFSA. So if you're thinking about various different schools, you want to kind of compare between the two and you want to see what a financial aid package would look like, as long as you've met any of the other requirements from the colleges and universities, you can have up to 20 colleges and universities listed on your FAFSA. And when they receive that information, and most colleges and universities will probably want to see some sort of a admission application as well. It's not always, but they will probably want to see that before they'll start building a financial aid offer for you. Once you receive that, you can then compare between the various colleges and universities, and in your comparison, if finance and what you may be receiving is going to heavily weigh where you can go to college or university, then obviously that would be a great comparison tool. But if by chance you have more than 20 schools that you are comparing, the initial FAFSA will allow for you to submit up to 20 schools information. When you get the data sent back to you, there's a process that will allow for you to be able to submit up to another 20 schools. So for a total of 40 that you would be able to send the FAFSA information out to have the financial aid office work on a financial aid offer for you. So right up front, you select if you're the student or the parent. The FAFSA is going to be asking you who is filling out the FAFSA. Only the questions for that role will be displayed, which is going to streamline your experience. So parents, you're not going to have to go through all the student-centric questions, and students, you're not going to have to answer the parent questions. User-defined roles mean that once the user logs in, they're going to have to identify themselves as, like I said, the student or the parent. And this was implemented in part due to the user's need to authorize the tax information transfer from the IRS. But it also helps speed up the FAFSA process by presenting users questions that are only pertinent to their role. And as previously discussed, once that user role is defined, the user is required to provide consent for their financial information to be accessed by the U.S. Department of Education from the IRS. And this also includes, I didn't mention on the previous slide, but it also includes non-tax filers via the FADDX process. So keep in mind that no index number will be calculated if authorization is not given. So, a couple slides back, I've been mentioning whether you are a dependent student or an independent student. So basically, FAFSA dependency is not the same as being claimed as a dependent on someone's tax return. Students are going to be considered independent if they are either, you basically have to answer yes to one of these questions. So you can be considered independent if you are either married, pursuing a graduate or professional degree like a Master of Arts or a Master of Science degree or maybe a PhD. Your birth date, you have at the time that you're filling out the FAFSA, are you 24 years old or older? Do you have dependents who receive their support from you? So essentially, do you happen to have a child? Are you an active duty military or veteran? So there's a question there. If you're active duty or military or you're a veteran of the military, uh, then you would be considered independent. And then lastly, if you are not considered active, well, I should probably include on that, if you're not considered active duty, but if you're in like an ROTC program or you're at a service academy or you happen to be in the National Guard or something along those lines, you may be eligible too for that. So basically, what you'll do is you'll walk through the question when you get through that, and they'll pose you with a question as to what your official status is with the military if you happen to not necessarily be active duty or a veteran. So go ahead and take a look at that and see if that applies to you and answer the question appropriately. It may determine whether or not you're independent or dependent. The last one too, in order to determine independency. Are you an orphan, or are you in foster care, or were you a ward of a court since the age of 13? So essentially, if you can answer yes, or if that happens to be a situation for you, or if you happen to be an emancipated minor, and of course, this is going to be applicable to state law. So check with the state of California, for instance, to determine emancipation of minors and determine what your eligibility for aid would be. Of course, obviously, if you happen to be in some sort of a legal guardianship, and that may have occurred after the age of 13 or before the age of 13, or maybe even if you're homeless or at risk of homelessness. So any of those possible situations in regard to your care, that may be able to determine whether you would be considered independent or dependent. Now, some of this, again, like I said, is going to have to be based on state law and what your status in regard to what the state determines your status is in order to answer the question correctly on the FAFSA. So if this situation does apply to you, you may want to read up on California state laws, again, to emancipation, orphan or foster care, or ward of the court, or if you happen to be in legal guardianship, in order to make sure you answer the question appropriately. So, who is considered a parent? And again, part of the reason why we want to establish whether you're going to be an independent or a dependent student is dependent upon, obviously, what income or incomes are going to be used on the FAFSA. If you are an independent student, then essentially independent students are responsible for just supplying their own personal income, or if you happen to be married but yet independent, then it may possibly be the joint household income, which would include your spouse's income and such. But let's go back to the dependent versus independent question. The way that if you're considered a dependent per the FAFSA, and again, this can be different than IRS tax purpose, who's considered a dependent. If you are a dependent per the FAFSA, then you are going to have a parent or parents information on your FAFSA. So you can see some of this slide here, who is considered a parent. One thing I also want to point out too is that married parents can also include same-sex couples. So if you need to have two parents information, essentially it would be legal parents that are married and they're married to each other and they live together. Legal parents are married to each other but do not live together, could be another status. Legal parents are not married but live together. Legal parent and step parent are married to each other and live together. A one-parent household would be considered legal parents that are separated or divorced, and have not remarried and live separately. So in this scenario, the student would put the parent that provides more than 50% of the support for the student. It's not always necessarily the parent that the student resides with. It's going to be the parent who provides more than 50% of the support for the student. Yes, typically this can be the student, the parent that the student lives with more than 50% of the time. But again, you'll probably have to do a quick analysis and determine, who actually supplies more than 50%. And the Department of Education, you may be saying to yourself, well, it's equal and our parenting plan is equal. The Department of Education is going to basically state then chances are not all of it is equal if you actually broke it down. Even though the parenting plan may potentially say that things are equal, it's not. So we want you to do a deeper dive and find out who actually is supplying more than 50%. And it can be 50.1%. And if that's the case, that's who the FAFSA wants as the parent of record on the FAFSA. Another single parent or one parent filing status would be a legal parent that is widowed or has never married. And I want to point out in that purple box there, if you're looking at your family situation and you're trying to do a deeper dive as to how, what parent, there should be a two-parent or one-parent filing, in your particular situation, you still have questions. The Department of Education has created a slide here that you can see, and the address is here. If you wanted to copy it down or take a picture of it or a screenshot of it, you can get the information. It's kind of a flow chart as to who a parent is. And new for the academic year 25-26 school year, academic year, the Department of Education has released what is called a parent wizard. Basically, it's going to be really handy when students, especially if you happen to be in a split household, you're trying to determine which parent needs to be added to the FAFSA. This parent wizard can be found at studentaid.gov. And a lot of information today can be found at studentaid.gov. But in order to look specifically for the parent wizard, you would want to go to studentaid.gov/FAFSA, FAFSA, hyphen, apply/parents. So again, that's studentaid.gov/FAFSA, hyphen, apply/parents. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the assets that are going to be recorded in on the FAFSA. And here's where we're going to outline the FAFSA requirements, what may need to have recorded on your FAFSA. And basically, this kind of highlights, a fundamental shift from anybody that may have filed a FAFSA in the past. You can see that there's been some categories that have changed that have either not been requested or asked for on the FAFSA in the past that may be being asked now, or like in the case of the FADDX, you may not necessarily be supplying income tax information, or you may have some of your information on the tax return, but the FAFSA is going to ask for additional information, especially when it comes to investment. So you can see here that they're going to be asking for families to report your business, as well as your your small business assets and worth, as well as your family farm assets and worth. And this is, of course, excluding the house that the family lives in. The FAFSA is not going to be asking for the house that you live in as far as an asset. They will be asking for, obviously, vacation homes, or any other type of investment property that you may have. But again, your primary home or the home that you live in is not going to be considered an asset for FAFSA purposes. Users will only need to report the net worth of their family farm or business as adjusted net worth, and it would be based on a formula within the FAFSA simplification process. Adjusted net worth is going to be a sliding scale based on the net worth of the business or the farm plus a set dollar amount. And that's going to be depending on the tier in which you fall into. And again, users, you only need to report the net worth of the family farm or the business. And the reason why I highlight that is that for anybody that might be on the call today that filed a FAFSA 2 years or more ago, this process was a little bit different. So I wanted to clarify that. Yes, if you did not use family farmer assets or business assets 2+ years ago, you are going to be required to do it moving forward. So just to highlight, assets that you must include on the FAFSA: rental properties, land, second home or summer homes. You will also have to include trust funds, uniform gifts for minors acts or UGMA custodial accounts, uniform transfer to minors act UTMA custodial accounts, money market funds, mutual funds, and CDs. You'll also have to report stocks and stock options as well as bonds, other securities as well if they happen to be residing outside a stock or a stock option or bond or a mutual fund. You'll have to report any installment or land sale contracts, and that includes mortgages held, and again, under the vacation home or investment property clause. Any commodities that you have. You will also have to report you'll have to report in a certain condition your 529 savings plan. So if you have been saving for college for a son or daughter, or have a 529 savings plan that's in an applicant's name or a beneficiary's name, that will have to be reported on the FAFSA. Any Coverdell education savings accounts, any business assets, and again, family farm and assets will all have to be included. And you can see on the right here, assets not included on the FAFSA is going to be the principal place of residence. You do not have to report any value of life insurance plans. You don't have to report retirement plans like 401k and SEP plans. You don't have to report pension funds or annuities, non-education IRAs, any KEO plans, personal possessions like your car, your furniture, your clothes, none of that has to be reported. Keep in mind that students and families must report the adjusted net worth of a business or small business, as well as the adjusted net worth of the family farm. And I want to reiterate that point again. So from that standpoint, you make sure that when you're completing that information, that's what you're reporting. So here's what happens after the FAFSA is submitted. So you've understood that the FAFSA has been made open for applicants. Maybe it's on or around December 1st. You go ahead, there's roughly 38 questions or so, I believe, on the FAFSA. So it should, the first time user filling out a FAFSA, it ought to take about 45 minutes or so. And each and every year that you fill out a FAFSA after that, the time allotted to fill it out will become much shorter. But FAFSA, once you fill out the FAFSA, it will essentially go to a federal FAFSA processor, an electronic processor. And again, 99.9% of FAFSA filers are going to be doing this via an electronic process out at fafsa.gov, studentaid.gov/FAFSA, any of the application links. And we'll give you the link here at the end. But essentially, when you filed out that FAFSA and you send it off, you've completed it, and you send it off to the processor, it can take, during peak periods, it might take a day or two longer, but normally it's going to take about 3 to 5 days or so for them to get the information, run it through their methodology calculations, and then get that information back to you. When that information does come back to you, it's going to come back to you in the form of what is called a FAFSA submission summary. And again, that is FAFSA submission summary. It's basically going to highlight or give you all the basic information about your eligibility for federal financial aid. And again, it's not going to include any financial information figures in this summary. So again, if you're uploading or requesting that the transfer of income tax information through the FADDX system is to take place, it's not going to be shared in the FAFSA submission summary when it comes back. It's going to also have all of the colleges listed that you asked to have the FAFSA information data electronically sent to. It's also going to have any status, were you selected for any processes? One in particular would be called, were you selected for a process called verification? And the idea is behind that is that the Department of Education randomly selects, and again, it's a random selection. They select a certain group of, or amount of individuals that have filed a FAFSA just to make sure that the paper tax return information is specific and the exact information as to what the FADDX transferred over in the electronic fashion. It also allows for them to verify how many family members there are and so on and so forth. And again, the financial aid office may be tasked with having to complete this verification process. and it will be listed on the FAFSA that you've been selected for this. So look for some sort of a communication coming from the college or colleges and universities that you're interested in attending in order to complete this verification process. You may have to get them some additional tax information or maybe some family information, how many are in the family, how many are going to school, so on and so forth. So that information is then the information that's going to be on the FAFSA submission summary. Like I said, it's going to be received at a college or university at the same time that you're receiving it via email. Colleges and universities may select or will select when they start downloading this information. So if you complete your FAFSA on December 1st, the day that it's scheduled to be open, or by December 1st, and you get your FAFSA submission summary roughly, 3 to 5 days later during peak, maybe 1 to 2 days later if it's non-peak times, then essentially your school or the schools you selected will be getting that information at approximately the same time as well. But note that financial aid offices may not be ready to download every applicant's FAFSA at that time. So just because it's been sent to you and it's been sent to the school does not mean that they're in a position that they can download it and start working on it appropriately or immediately. They may have to wait for their New Year's system to be updated. Remember, because you're filing this for the upcoming 25-26 academic year, they're still in a 24-25 academic year with students currently on campus. So in order to make sure that their systems can separate out the information appropriately, they may have to wait for a computer update or so on and so forth. But if they are able to download your FAFSA and they are able to start working on your financial aid offer for you, they are going to be looking for what is called the Student Aid Index Number. And here's another acronym, like we said before, that SAI number. They're going to be looking for that Student Aid Index Number, or SAI number, and that number is going to coincide with a series of calculations and business processes that will help them determine the aid types and the amounts that you are eligible for, not only, like I said, at the federal level, but also at the state level, and it applies for the state of California as well, and then any particular or specific institutional programs. So again, the SAI number is basically going to be a number, you may be asking what it is. What does student aid index, or what does SAI number mean? The SAI number is the output of the FAFSA formula. And basically it's used, like I said on the previous slide, to determine what types or how much aid a student is eligible for. I want to note that it is not a reflection of what a student or a family can or will pay. And also, too, it's not the amount of aid that a financial aid office would be giving to you either. It's simply just that. It's an index number. It is a needs analysis number, nothing more than that. The SAI can also be a negative number. It can go as low as negative 1,500. And keep in mind that a negative number does not qualify students for necessarily extra federal aid, and it does not increase the total amount of aid a student can receive. And rather, it's meant to allow schools to identify students who have increased need. So from that standpoint, again, the SAI number is not a monetary number either that you have to pay or your family has to pay, nor what you will be receiving. It is simply an index number that leads to a needs analysis that allows for financial aid office to determine your eligibility. Students can also qualify for federal Pell Grant in multiple ways. One way is to use that SAI number and subtract it from the maximum Pell Grant amount to determine your Pell Grant amount. The other way involves a number of parents in the household, your household size, and the income percentage of the federal poverty levels based on federal poverty tables. And family size is going to be based on the number of people claimed as exemptions on the tax form filed. And although this is a field that will be pulled directly from the tax forms via the FADDX process, FAFSA filers, you can put a family size on the FAFSA form to ensure accuracy. And it would be great if that number reflects what you put on your federal tax forms as far as people claimed within your household. If there is a difference, the financial aid offices are going to be used or are going to use the number that was retrieved from the FADDX. Parental information on the FAFSA is to be from the parent who provided the greatest portion of the student's financial support, as opposed to necessarily the custodial parent. In-kind support like housing, food, transportation, etc., that all should still be taken into consideration when you're determining financial aid for financial support. So when you're trying to make that calculation of who supplies more than 50%, make sure that you include not only the financial support, but the in-kind support, the housing, the food, the transportation, etc. And lastly, the number in college is no longer going to be asked or factored into the federal formula. So the SAI is not going to change no matter how many students or family members are in college. If you happen to have filled out the FAFSA 2+ years ago, that was a practice and where your FAFSA information could be split 50% by how many students, or even more than that, depending on how many students were in college. The question is still on the FAFSA. It's just no longer factored into the formula. So they are going to ask you how many are in the family, how many are planning on being in college. But from the factor of how they determine the SAI number and the amount of financial aid you are eligible to receive, the number in college is not going to pertain anymore. So on the previous one of the introductory slides, we talked about special circumstances, and I want to circle back to that because some of you may be looking at it and saying, okay, well, I'm filling out the FAFSA information, and if I'm filling it out for the academic year 25-26 year, they're going to be asking for a previous tax returns information. And depending upon when you're doing that, it could be your calendar year 2023 tax information. And obviously, if you're filling this out for the academic year 25-26, and maybe sometime in May of 2025, unfortunately, you learn that your company is restructuring and that you may be getting laid off, and you're saying, but I put all the FAFSA information with my income information from 2023 when it was showing that I was employed. How do I tell the school, or how do I tell the financial aid office that I no longer have this income coming in? And unfortunately, my financial situation is not going to be specific or reflect what I'm currently going through. Well, the way that you would be able to do that is through what is called a special circumstance. So basically, if there are circumstances or special circumstances which affect your ability to pay, like we said, a significant loss or reduction in income or assets, you may be due to a job loss, or maybe an injury, or death or serious illness, like we mentioned before, especially what's going on in many parts of the country right now, and maybe some of the fires and such that were happening in California over the summer, natural disasters, especially if it affected your primary house and such. Medical and dental expenses that are not covered by insurance. Let's say that there was a more than just a routine process that needed to be done, and you had some decent amount of financial responsibility that insurance didn't cover. Or maybe even if you have financial responsibility of elderly grandparents. All of this information can be put into a special circumstance letter and sent to the college or colleges and universities that you're looking at attending to see if they can take that information and make the FAFSA information, the financial information, more representative of what the current situation is that you're in now. I would contact the college or university, and you could try the admissions office, but also financial aid office as well. Contact them and find out what their special circumstance process is first. They may have a form that they want you to fill out, or they may want you to write a statement. So contact the college or university first before you draft a special circumstance, and find out what their process is. But all colleges and universities should have a process to account for special circumstances. Now, again, whether they can do something about it, depending upon what the situation is, might be specific to a college or university. They can't necessarily take all matters into account, but I would certainly ask them prior to filling anything out if they have a form or if they have some guidance as to what is considered a special circumstance, and maybe they'll ask you what your circumstance is and give you some guidance on whether or not that qualifies. So we've provided a lot of information today. And so I know that I've mentioned that studentaid.gov is the federal website that supplies a lot of the information about the FAFSA. It's also where you can start your FSA ID process. And when the FAFSA opens for academic year 25-26, studentaid.gov has a link to where the FAFSA process can be started. You can also go to fafsa.gov, or you can go to studentaid.gov/FAFSA in order to start the process. But also too, a lot of the information that we talked about today, plus any other type of financial education information, can be found here on the Provident Credit Union's Enrich website. You can see it there, providentcu.enrich.org. If you have a camera available on your smartphone or so and you want to take a picture of the QR code to the right, we'll leave this up for about 10 seconds more for you to take a quick snapshot of that. And you can certainly get additional information about financing, financial wellness and such at this link. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Well, that concludes our webinar today. Thank you all for attending, and I hope this session was helpful to you. As a reminder, we will be sending you a follow-up email with today's presentation. Have a good day, everyone.